My name is Dr. Lee Moore, and this is Podcast Taiwan Literature, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of one of the world's most fascinating islands, brought to you by the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. Today we're going to be talking about Wu Zhuoliu and his novel, The Orphan of Asia, the most important literary work in Taiwan before 1945. Well, really before the 1960s. So, who was Wu? Wu Zhuoliu is born in 1900 in Hsinchu. Hsinchu is located about an hour from Taipei by car or high-speed rail along Taiwan's northwest coast. Hsinchu is today famous as a tech hub for Taiwan. I would wager that everyone listening to this podcast right now is using a device that has some component that was made or designed in Hsinchu. But of course, in 1900, when Wu Zhuoliu is born, it was not a tech hub. It was a hub of Hakka culture. And you'll not be surprised to find that Wu himself was from a Hakka family. It has a large Hakka population. The Hakka comprise about 15 to 20% of Taiwan's people overall. They speak a Chinese language that's distinct from both Taiwanese and Mandarin, though distantly related to both of them. When I'm trying to explain Chinese languages to folks in the West, I talk about them as if they are Romance languages. So Hakka, Mandarin, and Taiwanese are about as closely related as Spanish, French, and Italian. That's a good way to wrap your head around the language situation in China and Taiwan. Wu Zhuoliu is born in 1900 in Hsinchu. That, of course, is 5 years into Taiwan being part of the Japanese Empire. And that empire is going to become the main topic of Wu's life and writing. Wu Zhuoliu, his great-grandfather, Wu Zhuoguan, had migrated from Guangdong to Taiwan in 1804. Wu Zhuoliu's grandfather, Wu Fangxin, was a well-known Chinese poet. His house was destroyed by the Japanese because of the family's resistance to the Japanese takeover of the island. Wu Fangxin became very circumspect in his resistance to the Japanese. He was not openly resistant after this initial defiance, but he did talk to his grandson, Wu Zhuoliu, about what the Japanese did to the family, planting a seed of hatred for the Japanese in Wu Zhuoliu's heart. That hatred was always tempered by the political and social realities that Wu Zhuoliu grew up in. So Wu was born in Taiwan when it was Japan's first colony. Speaking Japanese, becoming educated in Japanese in the Japanese school system, that was the road to wealth and power. And just like with Lai He, who we talked about in an earlier podcast, Wu Zhuoliu starts out by getting a traditional Chinese Confucian education, but when he is 11, the Chinese school he was going to closed. So he switches over to a Japanese-speaking school, and he is largely educated in Japanese. In 1916, at the age of 16, he enters the Taiwan Governor-General Language School Teacher Training Department. And for the next 2 decades after he graduates from this program, Wu is going to work as a teacher in Taiwan. One of the main problems he has with the educational system in colonial Taiwan is that he finds a lot of the Japanese workers look down on Taiwanese colleagues. Of course, he was right. This was colonialism, so there was a lot of racism and bigotry in Japanese colonialists. By 1940, Wu actually resigns his teaching position for this very reason. He just got tired of dealing with the bigotry he was exposed to. In order to avoid conscription, Wu flees to China. He had a former classmate, Zhong Renshou, who held a position in China's Wang Jingwei government. This classmate got him a passport that allowed him to go into China. But his time in China was short-lived. He frequently felt that Chinese folks accused anyone who was Taiwanese as working for Japan as a spy. He felt like he wasn't secure. He eventually left China and returned to Taiwan. He worked in Taipei during the rest of the war. He was working at the cultural department of a Japanese language newspaper, Taiwan Nichi Nichi Shinpo, the Taiwan daily newspaper. Because of this job, Wu had a relationship with lots of the leading cultural figures in Taipei at the time. One of those figures was Professor Kudo Yoshimi. Professor Yoshimi worked at what is today called the National Taiwan University, but back then was called Taihoku Imperial University. Professor Yoshimi encouraged Wu to write the novel that today we call the Orphan of Asia. Just to point something out here, I sometimes vacillate between Orphans of Asia and Orphan of Asia. Either one is correct because in Japanese and Chinese you don't have the same rules of singular and plural that you do in English. So the title can actually be translated both as Orphan of Asia and Orphans of Asia. The novel that made Wu famous is mostly written during the last years of the Great War in the Pacific. It was finished in May 1945 before Japan's surrender, but as Japan is clearly failing. Wu Zhuoliu had an active literary life in Taiwan after the novel is published, but this is the most important part of his oeuvre. And so we'll turn to that novel right now. As the title suggests, this novel is obsessed with questions of identity. This novel is the most important contribution to Taiwan literature during the Japanese colonization of the island. It highlights the injustice of Japan's colonization of Taiwan. It ridicules Taiwanese folks who are speaking only Japanese, who are exchanging their Chinese language names for Japanese language names. It generally is very skeptical of Japan's influence on the island. What language is this novel written in? If you thought it was written in Chinese, you would be wrong. Nope. It's written in Japanese, despite the skepticism. The most important work in early Taiwan literature is written not in Chinese, the language that most people in Taiwan speak today. Rather, it is written in Japanese, meaning that the most important literary work in early Taiwan literature can't be read in the original by most of Taiwan's population. Already, you have two questions emerging out of this strange situation. First, how Taiwanese is this novel? Does it belong within the Taiwanese literary canon, or does it rather belong in the Japanese literary canon? Don't have an answer to that. I'm just going to leave that out there. Second question. The problem of language in this novel highlights the convoluted history of Taiwan. I talked about this in the podcast on Taiwan's history. Today, there are Chinese nationalists in both China and Taiwan. They talk about Taiwan as if it has, for thousands of years, been closely tied to the Chinese motherland. That's problematic in a variety of ways, but one way it is problematic is that during the era from 1895 to 1945, the Taiwanese people, though most spoke either Taiwanese or Hakka at home, many, if not most, willingly participated in a public sphere that was Japanese. They wrote in Japanese. They lived their public lives in Japanese. That left a deep impression on the Taiwanese people. In 2013, I had a classmate. We were studying Chinese together at Taiwan Shifan Dashui, the National Taiwan Normal University. This classmate lived in Guangdu, a bit outside of central Taipei. My classmate was an American, but he spoke both Mandarin and Japanese. The old ladies living in his apartment complex did not generally speak Mandarin. They only spoke either Taiwanese or Japanese, so he ended up conversing with them in Japanese. This is in 2013, almost 7 decades after Japanese colonialism of the island ended, but there are still people who spoke only Taiwanese and Japanese, no Mandarin. That's how deep of a linguistic impression Japan has left on Taiwan. Okay, that's enough on language. I'm going to jump into the plot of the novel, and then we'll try to tease out themes at the end of this podcast. The plot is not particularly complicated. We follow the life of the main character, Hu Taiming, who seems largely like an autobiographical character modeled on the life of Wu Zhuoliu. The novel begins with the grandfather of Hu Taiming, a figure who doesn't seem all that different from Wu's own grandfather. Grandfather Hu takes young Hu Taiming onto a tea plantation. They look out, and Grandfather Hu says, "This used to be land that was unsafe. It was dominated by non-Chinese barbarians and Chinese bandits. If you went here, you were liable to get killed." Then grandfather and grandson look upon the tea plantations, and there is the sense that being, at least as they understand it, being here, you see that civilization has succeeded. I like this beginning. Initially, when I read it, I struggled to comprehend why is this placed here? It really does not add that much to the plot of the novel. But then I came to realize that this is the perfect beginning for this novel, because this novel is a Taiwanese epic. It charts the course of Taiwan from an early stage in its colonization by Han Chinese folks to the end of Japanese rule. By starting out with the grandfather and the grandson looking out over this land and how it has been transformed over 100-odd years, the novel begins in this Janus mode. One face looking backwards towards Taiwan's early Chinese colonial history, and then one face looking forward. Most of the novel is going to be occupied with that forward-looking face, but it's nice to have that backwards-looking face as well. The novel largely follows the life of Hu Taiming. Hu Taiming, as a boy, starts out with a Confucian education. He starts learning the Sanzi Jing. That's the book that's kind of like the Fisher-Price, My First Confucian Text. Hu Taiming continues through school. He has this crush on two women. It's described in some detail. One of them is Taiwanese, one of them is Japanese. Neither of the women fall in love with Hu Taiming, but they are rather symbols of two different identities. If Hu Taiming, and by extension Taiwan itself, remember I said that this is a Taiwanese epic, Hu Taiming's fate is pretty clearly a metaphor for the fate of Taiwan as a whole. As the novel presents it, if Hu Taiming chooses the Taiwanese woman, it's clear his fate will be bound to Taiwan, and he will have a Taiwanese identity. If Hu Taiming chooses the Japanese woman, it's clear his fate will be bound to Japan, and he will have a Japanese identity. This becomes a pattern throughout the novel. Whatever woman Hu Taiming loves is a symbol of the possible fate for him and for Taiwan. This kind of identity that he may adopt can be found in the body of whatever woman he's in love with. Just to give you an example, Hisako. This is the name of the Japanese woman who he has a crush on. He tries to pursue her romantically, but she states that the two of them are different and forever separated by their different ethnic backgrounds. Hu Taiming actually goes to Hisako's house and eats with her parents. He tries sushi for the first time, and he has a lot of trouble getting used to the taste of sushi. He's struggling there to eat sushi, and he says that the weird taste of sushi is, quote, the bittersweet taste of love. That's page 34 in the English translation. I've never thought of sushi that way, but I, from now on, will always think of that line when I'm eating sushi. Hu Taiming, eventually, just like Wu Zhuoliu, he flees Taiwan for China. He lives there. He finds Chinese women. They embody the sense of a Chinese identity for him. At one point, he says that these women, quote, seemed to embody the poetry of Chinese literature and to offer a history lesson with a whiff of the Analects, a classical ghost living in modern times through them, end quote. In other words, Chinese women smell kind of like the Confucian Analects, and they have this sense of Chinese literature about them. It's a very weird line. I'm not sure what to do with it. I just want to leave it out there. Hu Taiming eventually falls in love with a Chinese intellectual with tiny, tiny feet. The two of them fall in love talking about classical Chinese poetry. Again, the woman is invested with this national symbolic value. In her tiny feet, redolent of the bound feet of an older China, she is a symbol of the possibility of Taiwan marrying itself to a Chinese identity. Indeed, when Hu Taiming does marry this woman, Shu Chun, it seems like he will be forever linked to China. His fate is sealed. Taiwan and the Taiwanese identity are abandoned. Japan and the Japanese identity are abandoned. He is going to be Chinese. But something goes wrong. Shu Chun starts hanging out with other men. Hu Taiming is not used to this other aspect of China. That is, he's not used to the liberal modernity and openness that he associates with China and Chineseness as embodied by Shu Chun. In this China, women sleep around. They don't listen to their menfolk. At one point, Shu Chun, in a very masculine way, demands sexual intercourse from Hu Taiming. It's very clear that this openness of both Shu Chun and of China in general is something that Hu Taiming struggles to deal with. Hu tries to talk about Chinese poetry with his wife, but as their relationship gets worse and worse, she's no longer interested. Very briefly, Hu Taiming is jailed in China because he is a citizen of the Japanese Empire, but he's broken out by two women who he met earlier, teaching them poetry. Hu Taiming abandons his wife and abandons China as well. He goes back to Taiwan as the war in East Asia is intensifying. He works as a translator for Japanese officials. At one point, he encounters some Japanese soldiers. They hear that he has been in China, and they recount their own tales from China, and the brutality of these soldiers is exhausting. These Japanese soldiers complain that Taiwanese women are much more chaste than the women in China. Then they go on to recount how they stalked, raped, and murdered Chinese women as a part of their service to the Japanese Empire. One of these soldiers describes raping 2 women and then having his buddy shoot them from behind because he is afraid they're going to tell on him. Quote, "We jumped out to see more than 30 women and children. Upon seeing us, they quickly scattered like birds. 2 young ones didn't get away. They were shivering with fear, and we made them, my best experience ever. Afterward, though, my buddy thought we might get in trouble, and so, bang, he shot them from behind. It was cruel and heartless, after they had given us so much pleasure." End quote. And that passage typifies the end of the novel. As war becomes worse, the prospect for life is growing increasingly dark. And this is a little bit of a spoiler. Not much, but still it's a spoiler. So if you want to fast forward 30 seconds, now is the time to do it. He gets pushed to join the military, and eventually Hu Taiming's brother, whose name is Hu Zhinan, is killed. The novel ends with Hu Taiming going crazy and possibly escaping to Kunming in China to work at an anti-Japanese radio station. Though it's unclear if that's exactly what happens. It may be something different. So that is the plot. Let's talk about some themes in the novel. The main theme is the question of identity. Who is Hu Taiming? What is Taiwan? These are the questions that dominate the novel from the very beginning. Grandpa Hu, on page 12 of the English translation, early on in the novel asks, "Isn't Japanese culture just copying Western culture? Why is it valuable?" Here's the quote. Quote, "Although Western classics impressed him in some ways, he did not have much use for it, and wasn't Japanese culture merely copying it? His mind was full of admiration for the chronicles of Lu, the teachings of Confucius and Mencius, Han and Tang literature, Song and Ming science, and the magnificent culture of ancient China, as he wanted this heritage transmitted to his descendants at all cost." That's a pretty good encapsulation of Grandpa Hu's perspective on the value of these different identities. But pretty soon that changes. In just a few pages, Grandpa Hu comes to see the value of Western science as transmitted through Japanese culture. And he comes to be very skeptical of the value of Chinese culture. He thinks it needs to be abandoned. Quote, "The new thinking had apparently found its way to old Hu, who declared, 1,000 paragraphs written in the best civil examination style are no match for a single bomb." End quote. So in the space of just a few pages, Grandpa Hu has gone from saying, "I don't see the value of Japanese culture," to saying, actually, the culmination of all of this learning, these thousands of paragraphs written in the best style of classical Chinese for the imperial exam, that is nothing compared to the raw physical power of a bomb built with Western Japanese science. The question of identity is also one that Hu Taiming himself is grappling with throughout the whole novel. He struggles against Japanese discrimination. There are several points where he, his family, his friends are jeered at by Japanese folks. On several occasions, they yell, "Chink," at him. That's not my language. That's the language of the novel. Yet, despite this clear racism, Hu Taiming is always drawn to the value of Japan. He spends a brief spell in Japan as a part of his education. He never seems to completely abandon Japan. And of course, as I have to remind folks, this novel is written in Japanese. So Hu Taiming is being filtered through the lens of the Japanese language. He flirts at time with this Japanese identity. He flirts with a Taiwanese identity. And of course, he is married to a Chinese woman, which is symbolic of his attempt to marry himself to a Chinese identity. But the separation puts an end to that. The main theme of this novel is, what is Taiwan's identity? A secondary theme, what is the role of literature? Throughout these questions of identity, literature seems to be there at every turn. For a novel written in Japanese, there sure is a heck of a lot of classical Chinese literature in his novel. There are just numerous examples of Chinese poems that are in the narration by Hu Taiming. Hu Taiming's relationship with Shu Qun seems to rise and fall based on their discussions of classical Chinese poetry. There's one point where he disses Japanese people because they're unable to understand Li Bai. Here's the quote, "The city was diverse, with its fair share of beggars and those too weak even to beg, not to mention the thoroughly westernized native girls, the arrogant, pipe-toting Europeans, and those brainy Japanese who did not know about Li Bai's dreams." End quote. In other words, the narrator is measuring people by their ability to comprehend Chinese literature. This isn't the only time that happens. At the end of the novel, a Taiwanese lackey of the Japanese imperialist is insulting the Chinese, and he does so using a Li Bai poem. Hu Taiming points out that this lackey of the Japanese Empire has clearly misunderstood Li Bai's poem and Chinese poetry in general. He's clearly using earlier Chinese literature as a method for struggling with what it means to be Taiwanese and what it means to be Chinese. What is the relationship between Taiwan and China? Somehow this is embodied in the role that Chinese literature plays in the novel. I don't have an answer as to what that relationship should be in terms of how Hu Taiming is thinking of it, or in terms of how Wu Zhuoliu is thinking of it. What I can say is that literature is at the core of the struggle over identity. Finally, as we wrap this up, I want to voice a critique of the novel. One thing that I was puzzled with was how little role women play in this novel as full characters. There are lots of women in this story, but all of these women are very two-dimensional. They are meant to be symbols of the possible identities that Hu Taiming can adopt. I don't think there was a single woman in this story who was operating as a character on her own. Instead, they were all simply metaphors for different kinds of identity that Hu Taiming could adopt by having a sexual relationship with them. I get it. Zhuoliu is writing in a different era. I'm not trying to cancel him, but I think this is one of the things that actually made the novel very flat. So I'm not saying from some sort of social justice perspective that you shouldn't read this novel. I'm actually criticizing it from a literary perspective and saying, in not having any female characters, it actually made the novel much less enjoyable and much more honestly boring. Nevertheless, this is one of the most important novels in Taiwan literature. There's an English translation out there. It was published in 2006 by Columbia University Press. Go check it out. Wu Zhuoliu's Orphan of Asia. That's it for me. I'm going to sign off one more time by saying thank you in Taiwanese. 多谢